He moved her investment portfolio to his mistress. She found out before he could touch a dollar. There was something Deborah always did when she was worried. She would read a notification twice, then sit very still before deciding what to do next. So when she saw the alert on her computer that morning in her Madison office, she didn't panic. She simply read it again. The amount was large, the destination was unfamiliar, and then she saw Leonard's name attached to it. A second name appeared underneath, Camille. Deborah stared at the screen for a few seconds before picking up the phone. She already knew something was wrong. She just didn't know yet how wrong it was. Welcome to Daily Comfort Stories, my wonderful family. I'm truly grateful to have you here. If you're new, comment your time and where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe as we continue sharing meaningful stories together. By 9:30 that Tuesday morning, Deborah had already answered 3 emails, returned 2 phone calls, and reminded herself twice that she needed to eat something before lunch. She was sitting across from a woman named Patricia Sloan, who had been staring at the same retirement statement for nearly 10 minutes. Patricia was 62, recently divorced, and clearly uncomfortable being in Deborah's office. Not because of Deborah. Deborah had a way of making people feel at ease. It was the numbers that made Patricia uncomfortable. I keep looking at this, Patricia said, tapping the statement with one finger, and I honestly don't know what any of it means. Deborah smiled gently. That's okay. It doesn't feel okay. Most people don't understand every line on these statements. You're saying that because you do this for a living. I'm saying it because I do this for a living. Patricia gave a small laugh, but her eyes remained serious. Deborah leaned forward. Let's start with the part that matters most. You are not looking at a disaster. You're looking at a situation that needs a plan. Patricia looked up. There's a difference? A very big one. Deborah turned the statement around so they could look at it together. She did not rush. That was one of the things her clients trusted about her. Deborah never made people feel stupid for not understanding something. She knew that financial language could make ordinary people feel as though they were standing outside a locked door, waiting for someone more intelligent to let them in. So she explained everything plainly. What Patricia owned, what she owed, what income she could expect, what risks she needed to consider, what she could change, and perhaps most importantly, what she did not need to panic about. At one point, Patricia looked down at her hands. My ex-husband handled all of this. Deborah paused. There was a familiar sadness in the way Patricia said it. Not anger, not even resentment, just exhaustion. Deborah had heard that tone before. Well, she said quietly, now you know. Patricia looked at her. Know what? Your own money. Something changed in Patricia's expression. Deborah pointed to the statement. You don't have to become an investment advisor. That's my job. But you should understand what belongs to you, what it is doing, and what choices you have. Nobody should be the only person in the room who understands your financial life. Patricia nodded slowly. Deborah had said versions of those words for years. She believed them deeply. Money, in Deborah's mind, was never about showing off. It was about choices. The choice to leave a bad situation. The choice to help a child. The choice to survive an illness or a job loss without immediately becoming desperate. The choice to grow old without having to ask someone else for permission to feel safe. Money did not guarantee happiness. But understanding your money gave you choices. That was why Deborah had built her own finances carefully over nearly 2 decades. She invested consistently. She diversified. She kept emergency reserves. She read every document before signing it, even when the person across the table assured her that everything was standard. She had built a life that made sense to her, and, for the most part, her marriage had fit comfortably inside that life. That evening, Deborah arrived home a little after 6. Leonard was already there. His jacket was draped over the back of a dining chair, and he was standing in the kitchen with the refrigerator door open. Please tell me you're not eating dinner standing up, Deborah said. Leonard glanced over his shoulder. I was considering it. That's not dinner. It's a working meal. You're not working. He looked at his phone. Deborah noticed. Then he put it face down on the counter. Now I'm not. She smiled. That was Leonard. At least, that was the Leonard she knew. He kissed her cheek, asked about her day, and complained that the coffee machine was making a noise that sounded expensive. Deborah laughed. They had been married long enough to have hundreds of these tiny routines. The jokes, the familiar complaints, the way Leonard always left one cabinet door slightly open, the way Deborah closed it without mentioning it. There was nothing obviously broken between them. That was what made what came later so difficult to understand. Because betrayal is rarely painful only because of what someone did. Sometimes it hurts because you have to go back through ordinary memories and wonder which version of your life was real. That night, Deborah sat across from Leonard at their kitchen table, listening to him talk about a property he was developing on the east side of Madison. She asked a few questions. He answered. Then he reached for her hand across the table. "You're quiet," he said. "I'm tired." "Long day?" "Patricia Sloan." "Who's Patricia Sloan?" "A client." "Is she the one who thinks you're going to make her rich?" Deborah laughed. "No. She's the one who thinks she's going to die poor." Leonard squeezed her hand. "You're good at what you do." Deborah looked at him. "That's why I like it." She meant it. And at that moment, sitting across from the man she had loved for years, Deborah had no reason to believe that the life she had so carefully built was already beginning to change. She just didn't know it yet. The first time Deborah realized Leonard was coming home later, she didn't think much of it. It was a Thursday in October, and she was standing at the kitchen counter with one hand wrapped around a mug of tea when she heard the garage door open. She glanced at the clock. 8:47 p.m. "You're late," she said when Leonard walked in. Leonard took off his coat. "I know. Everything okay?" "Yeah." He said it quickly, not defensively, not yet. Deborah watched him put his keys in the small wooden bowl by the door. "You eat?" "Not really." "There's chicken." "I'll heat it up." She nodded and returned to her tea. That was all. At the time, she didn't think of it as a warning. Leonard's business had always demanded long hours. There had been late meetings before, unexpected problems with contractors, tenants who called after business hours, and projects that seemed determined to create new emergencies every time Leonard thought he had solved the old ones. So when he came home late, Deborah did what she had always done. She made room for it. A few weeks later, he came home at 10:16, then 9:38, then almost 11. The explanations were always reasonable. A contractor had missed a deadline. A city inspector had raised a concern. A lender wanted additional documentation. A tenant had changed their mind. None of it sounded impossible. In fact, that was what made it difficult. There was always enough truth in Leonard's explanations to make the rest of the story believable. One evening, Deborah was clearing plates from the dining table when Leonard's phone vibrated. He looked at it immediately. Not casually, immediately. His hand moved across the table before he seemed to realize Deborah was watching. Then he turned the phone over. Deborah raised an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" "Yeah." "Work?" "Just something I need to deal with." "Tonight?" Leonard looked at her. "Probably." She put a plate in the sink. "Do you want me to leave you alone?" "No." The answer came so quickly that Deborah stopped. Leonard seemed to notice. He sighed. "I'm sorry. I'm just tired." Deborah nodded. "Okay." He reached for her hand. "Things are just complicated right now." "What things?" "Business." "What about it?" "Nothing you need to worry about." Deborah looked at him for a moment. There was something about the phrase that bothered her. Not because Leonard had said it before, because he had started saying it more often. Nothing you need to worry about. Deborah had heard those words from clients before. Usually they were followed by a discovery that there was, in fact, something to worry about. Still, she let it go. That was one of Deborah's contradictions. She could spend 2 hours examining a client's portfolio because a single unexplained transaction appeared in the wrong place. But when it came to Leonard, she trusted the person before she questioned the information. She told herself there was a difference. A marriage was not a client relationship. A husband was not a financial statement. And if Leonard needed help, he would ask. At least, that's what she believed. The problems with his business became more serious during the winter. One Saturday morning, Leonard was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open when Deborah walked in and found him staring at a spreadsheet. He closed it. She noticed. "You don't have to close it. Because I'm here. I wasn't closing it because of you. Okay. I just finished. Deborah poured herself coffee. What are you working on? Cash flow. Which project? The Monroe property. She leaned against the counter. I thought that one was doing well. It is. Then why are you looking at cash flow? Leonard gave her a tired smile. Because I'm a developer, Deborah. That's what I do. She smiled back, but his answer didn't quite satisfy her. Still, she didn't push. A few weeks later, Leonard mentioned that the bank had changed the terms on one of his loans. That's frustrating, Deborah said. It's temporary. Did they give you a reason? Market conditions. Deborah frowned. That's vague. Leonard looked up from his plate. You're not my banker. I know. Then trust me. The words landed harder than he intended. Deborah became quiet. Leonard immediately softened. That's not what I meant. I know. I'm just saying I have it handled. Deborah nodded. Okay. And she believed him. Or, perhaps more accurately, she wanted to. By spring, Leonard had started borrowing against one property to support another. He described it as strategic, temporary, a way of keeping capital moving until the market improved. To Deborah, none of those explanations sounded immediately reckless. Real estate was complicated. Projects rarely moved in straight lines. She knew that. What she didn't know was how many times Leonard had already repeated those explanations to himself. Around that time, Deborah began meeting more often with Dr. Miriam Calloway. Miriam had been Deborah's closest friend since their college years, and unlike most people in Deborah's life, she had known her before the career, before the marriage, before Deborah had learned to present herself as the woman who always had a plan. One Saturday afternoon, they sat at a small cafe on Monroe Street, while rain tapped against the windows. Miriam stirred honey into her tea. So, how's Leonard? Deborah took a sip of coffee. Busy. Miriam looked at her. That's not what I asked. Deborah smiled. He's fine. You're doing that thing. What thing? Answering the question you wish I'd asked. Deborah laughed. He's under pressure. Why? Business. Miriam waited. Deborah knew that look. Don't. I haven't said anything. You're about to. Miriam leaned back. Do you trust him, Deborah? Or do you just trust the person you remember him being? Deborah stared at her. For a moment, she didn't have an answer. Then she shook her head. You're a therapist. You make everything sound like a crisis. No, I'm a friend. That's why I'm asking. Leonard is working hard. That wasn't my question. Deborah looked out the window. She thought about the late nights, the phone calls, the spreadsheets that disappeared when she entered the room. The phrase Leonard kept repeating, nothing you need to worry about. Then she looked back at Miriam. I trust my husband. Miriam nodded slowly. Okay. There was something about the way she said it that irritated Deborah. Why did you say it like that? Like what? Like you don't believe me. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Miriam reached across the table and touched Deborah's hand. I'm not telling you Leonard is doing something wrong. Good. I'm asking you not to confuse trust with not looking. Deborah pulled her hand back gently. I know what I'm doing. Miriam studied her for a moment. Then she smiled. I know you do. The conversation moved on. They talked about Miriam's work, Deborah's clients, and a ridiculous television show they had both started watching. By the time Deborah drove home, the rain had stopped. The roads were wet. The sky was turning gray, and Miriam's question was still sitting somewhere in the back of her mind. Do you trust him, or do you trust the person you remember him being? Deborah didn't like the question, mostly because she had no idea which answer scared her more. The redevelopment project had started as one of Leonard's better ideas. At least, that was what he told himself. The neighborhood on the south side of Madison had been changing for years. Some of the older buildings had been left vacant, while newer developments seemed to appear around them almost overnight. Rents were climbing. Longtime business owners were worried they would eventually be priced out. Leonard had seen an opportunity there, not just a financial one. He wanted to take several neglected properties and turn them into something useful. Affordable storefronts on the ground floor, shared workspaces above them, a small business incubator where people with good ideas could actually afford to start. The numbers were complicated. The financing was even more complicated. But Leonard believed in the project. And for a while, Deborah believed in it too. She remembered the first dinner when he had explained the idea to her. They had been sitting at a restaurant near Capitol Square, and Leonard had spent most of the meal talking with his hands. "I don't want another development where everything looks nice and nobody who actually lives there can afford to stay," he had said. Deborah had smiled. "That's very noble of you." Leonard had laughed. "Don't make it sound like I'm running for office. I'm just saying. I'm serious." "I know." She had believed him. That was the thing about Leonard. When he believed in something, other people could feel it. The problem was that belief had always been one of his strengths and one of his weaknesses. He could see the future he wanted so clearly that sometimes he stopped paying attention to the present. That was how Camille first entered his life. She had been working with several local business owners whose leases were coming up for renewal. Camille was organized, direct, and difficult to impress. During their first meeting, Leonard spent nearly 20 minutes explaining his vision. When he finished, Camille looked at him. "That's a nice speech." Leonard blinked. "A speech?" "Yes. It's a development plan. It's a speech until you tell me how much the rent will be." Leonard laughed. Camille didn't. "People don't live inside visions, Leonard. They live inside budgets." Something about that stayed with him. He began asking her questions. She began answering them. Soon, they were meeting regularly. At first, it was entirely professional. Camille knew the neighborhood better than Leonard did. She understood the problems small business owners faced because she had spent years working with them. Leonard respected her. More than that, he liked the way she challenged him. When his plans became too ambitious, she told him. When he ignored a practical problem because he was focused on the bigger picture, she brought him back to it. And when the project began experiencing delays, Camille was one of the few people who did not immediately treat Leonard like a man who had failed. She simply asked what needed to be done next. That mattered more than Leonard wanted to admit, because by then, the pressure on his business had begun affecting him in ways Deborah could not see. The construction delays had become expensive. The financing terms were worse than they had been when he started. A major tenant had backed out of one property, leaving a hole in the numbers that Leonard could not easily fill. He was borrowing money to keep projects moving. Every time he solved one problem, another appeared. At home, Deborah saw a man who was tired. Camille saw a man who was afraid. That difference became important. One evening, Leonard and Camille were standing outside one of the redevelopment properties after a meeting with a contractor. It was cold. Camille pulled her coat tighter around herself. "You're not listening." Leonard looked at her. "To what?" "Your own numbers." He frowned. "I know my numbers." "No, you know what you want your numbers to become." Leonard stared at her. Camille sighed. "I'm not trying to insult you. Feels like it. I'm trying to tell you that this project can't survive on optimism." Leonard looked at the unfinished building behind them. "I know. Do you?" He didn't answer. For the first time in months, Leonard felt something he had not felt at home. Not comfort, recognition. Camille understood that he was scared. And instead of telling him not to worry, she was willing to stand there and acknowledge that there was something to worry about. The emotional boundary between them did not disappear in one dramatic moment. It happened in small ways. A conversation that lasted longer than it needed to. A late-night message about the project that became a conversation about their lives. A coffee that had nothing to do with business. A moment when Leonard told Camille something about himself that he had not told Deborah. He began looking forward to seeing her. Then he began looking for reasons to see her. And eventually, he stopped pretending to himself that the relationship was professional. The first time Camille confronted him about Deborah, they were sitting in her car outside the redevelopment office. "You're married." Leonard looked out the windshield. "I know. Then what are we doing?" Leonard was quiet. Camille turned toward him. "I need you to answer me." "It's complicated." "No, it's actually not." "Camille." "If you're going home to your wife every night and telling me you're going to leave her someday, I need to know whether I'm waiting for something that's never going to happen." Leonard rubbed his forehead. He could have told her the truth. He could have said that his marriage was not over. He could have said that Deborah was still his wife, that they still shared a home, that they still had affection for each other. He could have admitted that he had no plan for leaving. Instead, he chose a version of the truth that made his choices easier. Deborah and I have been finished for a long time. Camille watched him. Then why are you still married? Leonard hesitated. Because things aren't that simple. Camille looked away. She wanted to believe him. Leonard could see that. And because he wanted to keep her, he gave her what she needed to hear. He told her that the marriage had become more like a partnership, that he and Deborah had grown apart, that they were living separate emotional lives. He never mentioned the ordinary evenings at home, the jokes, the dinners, the way Deborah still knew exactly how he liked his coffee. He never mentioned that when he was sick, she still sat beside him. He never mentioned that he still reached for her hand without thinking. He told Camille only the parts of his marriage that supported the story he was telling. And slowly, he began believing that story himself. Meanwhile, Deborah knew nothing. She continued working. She continued meeting clients. She continued building her financial future. At home, she noticed Leonard was distracted, but she attributed it to the business. When he said he had another late meeting, she believed him. When he said the redevelopment project was taking up more time than expected, she accepted it. When he became distant, she gave him space. She did not know that another woman had become part of the emotional world Leonard was keeping separate from her. And Leonard became increasingly skilled at moving between those worlds. With Deborah, he was the husband who was under pressure. With Camille, he was the man whose marriage was already over. With his business partners, he was the developer who had a plan. With himself, he was the man who believed he could still fix everything. Each version contained a piece of the truth. None contained all of it. That was Leonard's greatest mistake. He did not think of himself as a liar. He thought of himself as someone managing a difficult situation until he could make everything right. But every day he delayed the truth, the distance between those different versions of his life grew wider. And somewhere in the middle of all of it was Deborah, still believing that the man sitting across from her at the kitchen table was the same man she had married. She had no idea that Leonard had already begun making decisions about a future that did not include her. And she certainly had no idea that, before long, the financial problems he was hiding would force him to make a decision that would change all three of their lives. By the following summer, Leonard had stopped saying that the problems were temporary. He still acted as though they were. There was a difference. Temporary problems had deadlines. They had solutions. They could be written down on a whiteboard, discussed over coffee, and handled one at a time. What Leonard was dealing with had begun to spread. The Monroe property needed more money. A different development was behind schedule. One lender wanted additional assurances before releasing the next draw, while another had started asking questions Leonard found increasingly difficult to answer without revealing how much pressure the company was actually under. Then one of his investors called him on a Monday morning and asked a question Leonard had been avoiding. "When do we see the return?" Leonard sat behind his desk, looking through the glass wall of his office at employees moving between conference rooms. "Once the project is stabilized." "That's what you said 3 months ago." "I know. So what's changed?" Leonard rubbed his forehead. "Construction." "Construction is always part of the project." "I understand that." The investor went quiet. Leonard could feel the irritation building in his chest. He wanted to tell the man that he was doing everything he could. Instead, he said, "We're close." The call ended 10 minutes later. Leonard remained in his chair. His office was quiet. On his desk sat 3 folders. One contained revised construction estimates. Another contained financing documents. The third contained a list of obligations that were coming due faster than the money was coming in. Leonard stared at them. Then he closed his eyes. For years, he had been the man who knew what to do next. Now he was beginning to understand what it felt like to have no good next move. The redevelopment project was becoming especially dangerous. Camille's relationships with the small business owners had made the project more than a financial investment. People had started making decisions based on promises Leonard had made. Terrence Bell was one of them. Terrence owned a small neighborhood bakery and had been preparing to move into one of the renovated storefronts. When Leonard walked into Terrence's current shop one afternoon, the smell of cinnamon and coffee filled the air. Terrence came out from behind the counter. "You're late." Leonard glanced at his watch. "Sorry. You said you'd have an update last month." "I know." "Then you said 2 weeks." "I know." Terrence folded his arms. "My landlord wants an answer by Friday." Leonard looked at him. "Terrence." "No, Leonard. I need an answer." "We're working through the financing." Terrence laughed once, not because anything was funny. That's what everybody says when they don't have an answer. Leonard's jaw tightened. "The project is happening." "Is it?" "Yes." "Then tell me when." Leonard couldn't. Terrence looked at him for a long moment. "My employees are depending on me." "I understand. My wife is depending on me." "I understand. My whole business is depending on this." Leonard nodded. "I said I understand." Terrence lowered his voice. "Then stop telling me what you think I want to hear." The words followed Leonard out of the bakery. That evening, he met with Elliot Vance. Elliot had been Leonard's attorney for years. He was not the kind of man who raised his voice when something went wrong. That made his silence more unsettling. He placed a document on the table. "Leonard, we need to talk about your exposure." Leonard looked at him. "I know. No, I don't think you do." Leonard leaned back. "Then explain it." Elliot opened the folder. "You've been moving money between projects to cover shortfalls." "That's normal." "Not at this level." Leonard looked away. Elliot continued. "You're using one property to support another. You're refinancing assets to maintain liquidity. You're extending obligations based on revenue that hasn't materialized yet." "It will." "Maybe." Leonard looked sharply at him. "That's the entire point of development." "The point of development is not the issue." "Then what is?" "The issue is that you are running out of room." Leonard said nothing. Elliot's voice softened. "You need to consider shutting down some of these projects." "No." "Leonard, no. You cannot keep every promise you've made." Leonard stood. "I can fix this." Elliot watched him. "That's what worries me." Leonard stopped. Elliot closed the folder. "You keep saying you're going to fix it, but every solution you're considering requires another solution after that." Leonard stared at him. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Leonard left. He drove home in silence. When he entered the house, Deborah was sitting at the dining table with her laptop open. She looked up. Hey, you okay?" Leonard hung his coat. "Just tired." Deborah studied him. "You've been saying that a lot." He smiled faintly. "Because I've been tired a lot." She closed the laptop. "Do you want to talk?" The question almost broke something inside him. For one brief moment, Leonard imagined telling her everything. The debt, the failed projections, the lenders, the investors, the project that might collapse, the possibility that he could lose the company he had spent decades building. He imagined Deborah listening. He imagined her asking questions. He imagined the disappointment in her face. Then he imagined something worse, her leaving. Leonard swallowed. "I've got it." Deborah nodded. "Okay." She reopened her laptop. Leonard walked upstairs. That night, he stood alone in their bedroom, looking at himself in the mirror. He thought about Elliot's words, running out of room. Then, almost against his will, another thought entered his mind. Deborah's portfolio. He rejected it immediately. No, absolutely not. That was her money, her security, her future. He knew that better than anyone. He knew exactly what that portfolio meant to her. But then another thought followed. Not taking it, borrowing it. There was a difference, wasn't there? If he moved enough capital to stabilize the project, he could recover. If the property sold, he could replace the money. If the redevelopment succeeded, everyone would benefit. Terrence would keep his business. The employees would keep their jobs. The investors would get their returns. Deborah would get her money back. Leonard sat on the edge of the bed. He knew what Deborah would say. She would ask questions. She would want documents. She would examine every assumption. She would tell him to stop pretending a failing project could be saved by throwing more money into it. And that was when Leonard's thinking shifted. Not because he believed Deborah was wrong, because he was afraid she would say no. He stared at the floor. The money was hers. He knew that. The decision was his to make. He knew that too. And yet, somewhere between fear and desperation, Leonard began telling himself a story. He wasn't stealing from his wife. He was saving their future. He wasn't betraying her. He was protecting her. He wasn't risking her security. He was protecting it. By the time Leonard went to sleep that night, he had not transferred $1, but something important had already happened. For the first time, he had allowed himself to believe that Deborah's money could solve a problem she had never agreed to help him solve. And once he convinced himself that borrowing her future was a form of protecting it, the line he had spent his entire life believing he would never cross suddenly became much easier to approach. Leonard did not act on the idea the next morning. That mattered to him. For several days he told himself he was still thinking. He went to meetings. He reviewed construction estimates. He spoke with lenders. He answered calls from investors who wanted updates he could no longer give with confidence. And every night, when the house became quiet, the same thought returned. Deborah's portfolio. He knew exactly how much she had. He knew which accounts were separate from their household finances. He knew which investments were liquid and which were not. He knew because Deborah had never hidden her financial life from him. That was the part that made what he was considering so difficult to defend. She had trusted him with knowledge. He was now thinking about using that knowledge against her. Leonard tried to make the distinction smaller. He wasn't going to take everything. He wasn't even going to take it permanently. He only needed enough to create breathing room. A bridge. That was the word he started using in his own head. A bridge. He needed to get from where the company was now to where he knew it could be. Once the properties were stabilized, once the financing was reorganized, once the market improved, he could put everything back. Nobody would lose anything. That was how he explained it to himself. The problem was that Deborah had not agreed to build that bridge. One afternoon, Leonard called someone connected to the investment structure he had created for the redevelopment project. He did not ask for instructions on how to steal money. He was more careful than that. He asked questions. What documentation would be required if an investor wanted to contribute capital? What verification would be needed? How quickly could a transfer be processed? What would happen if the contributing party already had an existing relationship with another financial institution? The questions sounded ordinary, professional, but Leonard knew why he was asking them. He was trying to understand whether there was a way to make the transaction appear legitimate, long enough for it to happen. He knew Deborah's assets were independently owned. He knew he did not have the authority to simply transfer them, so he began looking for a way around the obstacle. The more he learned, the more uncomfortable the idea became. There were verification requirements. There were signatures. There were compliance checks. There were safeguards designed specifically to prevent unauthorized transactions. Leonard understood what those safeguards meant. Someone would have to believe the request was legitimate. Someone would have to believe Deborah had authorized it. He sat alone in his office one evening and stared at the computer screen. For a moment, he almost closed everything. Then his phone rang. It was Camille. He answered. "Hey, where are you?" "At the office." "Still?" "Yeah." There was a pause. "You sound tired." "I am." "Leonard, we need to talk." He leaned back. "About what?" "The project." He closed his eyes. "Camille." "No, please don't do that." "Do what?" "Give me that voice." "What voice?" "The one you use when you want me to stop asking questions." Leonard looked toward the window. Outside, Madison was settling into evening. "I don't have time for this tonight." "That's exactly the problem." He said nothing. Camille continued. "People are waiting. Terrence is waiting. The other business owners are waiting. And you keep telling everybody that the money is coming." "It is." "From where?" Leonard's eyes opened. "Why are you asking me that?" "Because I want to know." "It's being handled." "That's not an answer." He stood from his chair. "Camille, I'm doing everything I can." "I know." Her voice softened. That's what scares me. Leonard walked across the office. What does that mean? It means you look like someone who's running out of options. He stopped. I'm not. Then tell me I'm wrong. Leonard stared at the floor. He couldn't. Camille's voice became quieter. Leonard, I'm here. Is the money you're talking about Deborah's? The question hit him harder than he expected. He turned toward the window. No. Camille waited. Leonard, it's not what you think. Then what do I think? He didn't answer. Is it her money? Leonard rubbed his hand over his face. I haven't taken anything. Camille went silent. That wasn't what she had asked. That's not what I asked you. I'm trying to save the project. By using her money? I said, I haven't taken anything. But you're thinking about it. Leonard's silence answered her. Camille let out a breath. Oh, my God. Camille. No. Listen to me. No, you listen to me. Her voice was shaking now. You told me your marriage was over. It is. Then why are you using her money? I'm not using her money. You're trying to. Leonard couldn't argue with that. Camille laughed bitterly. Do you hear yourself? I am trying to protect people. By doing something your wife doesn't know about, it's temporary. There it is. What? That's what people say when they know they're doing something wrong. Leonard felt anger rise inside him. You don't understand the situation. Then explain it. I can't. Why? Because it's complicated. Camille was quiet. Then she said something Leonard would remember for years. Everything with you is complicated when the truth would make you look bad. He felt something inside him tighten. That's not fair. Isn't it? No. Then tell me the truth. Leonard sat down again. For the first time, he realized that the story he had told Camille about his marriage had begun to unravel. He had told her Deborah was emotionally distant. He had told her the marriage was essentially finished. He had told her he was preparing for a different life. But now Camille was beginning to see that Deborah was not some distant figure Leonard had left behind. She was still his wife. She was still living in their home. She still had no idea about the affair. And Leonard was now considering using her money to rescue a project that involved the woman he claimed he loved. Camille finally spoke. I don't know what I'm involved in anymore. Leonard's voice softened. Camille, I need you to figure this out. I will. No. You need to figure out what you're doing. The call ended. Leonard sat alone. He looked again at the documents on his desk. The investment structure, the projected returns, the financing gap, the amount he needed. Then he opened a separate file containing information about Deborah's portfolio. He stared at it. He knew exactly what he was doing. That was the truth. He could no longer escape. He was not simply thinking about a bridge anymore. He was planning. The next morning, Leonard began taking steps to prepare a transfer request. He used information he already had access to through their shared financial life and the documentation surrounding the investment structure. He knew he would have to create the appearance that Deborah had approved the transaction. That thought made him stop. His hand remained over the keyboard. For several seconds, he did nothing. Then he told himself the same thing he had been telling himself for weeks, just until the project survives. He proceeded. The request was submitted for review. Leonard expected the process to move quickly. He believed he had managed the details carefully enough that Deborah would not see anything until the transaction was already underway. And once the money arrived, he would fix everything. That was his plan. Or at least, that was the story he needed to believe. Because Leonard still refused to face the simplest truth. The moment he tried to make Deborah appear to authorize something she had never approved, this stopped being a financial strategy. It became a betrayal he could no longer explain away as love, protection, or temporary necessity. He had crossed the line. He just didn't know yet that Deborah was about to find out before he could touch a single dollar. The alert arrived on a Tuesday morning. Deborah was sitting at her desk in the Madison office, working through a stack of client reports she had promised herself she would finish before lunch. Outside her window, the city was beginning another ordinary day. Cars moved slowly through the intersection. Someone across the street was carrying a paper coffee cup with both hands. Her assistant had already stopped by once to ask whether she wanted anything from the cafe downstairs. Deborah had said no. She was trying to concentrate. Then the notification appeared. She almost dismissed it. There were always notifications, account updates, routine confirmations, messages from custodians, quarterly statements. Most of them required little more than a glance. This one was different. Deborah's eyes moved across the screen. She stopped. Then she read it again. The amount was large, very large. Her expression changed. She clicked into the notification. The destination was an investment structure she did not recognize. Deborah leaned closer to the screen. She knew most of the accounts connected to her portfolio. She knew the institutions. She knew the funds. She knew the private investments. She knew why she owned them. This was unfamiliar. She scrolled down. Then she saw a name. Leonard, her husband. Deborah sat back. For several seconds, she didn't move. There was a reasonable explanation. There had to be. Perhaps the structure was connected to one of Leonard's development projects. Perhaps something had been entered incorrectly. Perhaps the notification had been generated automatically because of an administrative error. She kept reading. Then she saw another name. Camille. Deborah's fingers stopped moving. She stared at the screen. She did not know a Camille. Not one connected to Leonard. Not one connected to her money. Her first reaction was not anger. It was professional disbelief, the kind she had felt when clients brought her documents that did not make sense, the kind that made her slow down instead of react. She read the notification a third time. Then she picked up the phone. "Good morning," she said when someone answered. Her voice was calm. "My name is Deborah. I'm calling about an attempted transaction on one of my accounts." She gave the necessary information. The representative placed her on hold. Deborah waited. Her eyes remained fixed on the screen. When the representative returned, Deborah asked the question she had been holding in her mind. "Has the transaction been processed?" "No." Deborah exhaled. "Has any money moved?" "No." Her shoulders relaxed slightly. Then she asked, "Why was I notified?" There was a pause. "Because the request was flagged for verification." Deborah's posture changed. Verification of what? Authorization. The word seemed to settle over the room. Deborah looked at the screen again. Who authorized this? Another pause. "We're not able to confirm the identity of the person who submitted the request until the review is completed." Deborah's voice became firmer. "Then tell me what you can confirm." The representative explained that the request had been received and was being held because additional verification was required. Deborah listened carefully. She asked questions. She took notes. She requested documentation. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse anyone. Not yet. By the time the call ended, Deborah had already begun documenting everything. The date, the time, the transaction amount, the destination, the names attached to the investment structure, the status of the request. She printed the notification. Then she printed the related information. She placed everything in a folder. Only after she had finished did she allow herself to think about what it meant. Leonard, Camille, her portfolio, together. The three words did not belong in the same sentence. Deborah picked up her phone again. This time, she called Marisol Vega. Marisol was a senior compliance officer at the custodian and someone Deborah had worked with professionally before. "Marisol, I need you to tell me something." "Of course." "There's a transaction request on my account." "I know." Deborah paused. "You know? We're reviewing it." "Why?" "Because something didn't clear our verification process." Deborah looked down at the folder on her desk. "Marisol, I need to know whether someone tried to move my assets." Marisol was quiet. "Yes." Deborah closed her eyes. "How much?" Marisol gave her the figure. Deborah already knew the amount from the notification. Hearing it spoken aloud made it different. She swallowed. "Did the transfer happen?" "No." "Are you certain?" "Yes." "Has anything left my account?" "No." Deborah leaned back. For the first time that morning, she allowed herself to breathe. "Then what happened?" Marisol explained that the request had been flagged before completion and that additional verification had prevented the transaction from proceeding. Deborah listened. Then she asked, "Who authorized it?" "We're still reviewing that." "Marisol, I understand. Was it Leonard?" Silence. Deborah didn't need an answer. She already knew. The silence was enough. When the call ended, Deborah remained at her desk. She stared at the folder. Her mind began doing what it always did when faced with uncertainty. It built a sequence: the late nights, the phone turned face down, the unexplained meetings, the business problems, the investment structure, Camille. She remembered Miriam's question: "Do you trust him, or do you just trust the person you remember him being?" Deborah had hated that question. Now she understood why. She closed the folder. Then she picked up her purse. She left the office without telling anyone where she was going. The drive home felt strangely ordinary. That almost made it worse. She passed the same streets she had driven for years, the same traffic lights, the same grocery store where she and Leonard sometimes stopped on Sunday afternoons. Nothing outside the car had changed, but Deborah felt as though she had stepped into a different life. When she arrived home, Leonard's car was already in the driveway. She sat behind the steering wheel for a moment. Her hands rested loosely in her lap. She thought about calling him. She thought about asking him over the phone. Then she decided against it. She wanted to see his face. Leonard was in the kitchen when she walked through the door. He looked up. "You're home early." Deborah set her purse down. "Yes." "Everything okay?" She looked at him. The question almost made her laugh. Not because it was funny, because it was so perfectly wrong. "Is everything okay with you?" Leonard's expression changed slightly. "What do you mean?" Deborah walked to the dining table. She removed the folder from her purse. Leonard watched her. She placed it on the table. Then she sat down. "Come here." He didn't move. "Deborah." "Leonard." Something in her voice made him stop. He walked toward the table. Deborah opened the folder. She removed the first page. Then she placed it between them. Leonard looked down. The color seemed to leave his face. Deborah watched him carefully. She had expected anger, denial, confusion. Instead, she saw something else. Fear, not surprise. Fear. That was the moment everything inside Deborah became very still. She didn't need to ask whether the transaction was real. She didn't need to ask whether he knew about it. His face had already answered those questions. Deborah looked at the papers. Then she looked at her husband. "What is this?" Leonard opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Deborah waited. And in that silence, she finally understood something that would change the rest of her life. Whatever Leonard had been hiding from her, it was much bigger than an affair. Because Camille's name was not sitting on that document by accident. Her money was not connected to that investment structure by accident. And Leonard's fear was not the reaction of an innocent man who had just been accused of something he didn't understand. Deborah looked at him again. This time, she did not see the man who had walked into the kitchen years earlier and complained about the coffee machine. She saw a man who had been making decisions in secret, a man who had believed he could control what she knew, a man who had tried to move her future without asking her permission. And for the first time in their marriage, Deborah understood that the question was no longer whether she trusted Leonard. The question was how much of the life she thought they had built together had been real. Leonard finally sat down. Deborah pushed the papers toward him. "Start talking." And Leonard knew, before he said a single word, that the life he had spent months trying to hold together had finally reached the moment he had feared most. Deborah was no longer willing to believe him without seeing the truth for herself. Leonard looked at the papers on the table as though they had been placed there by someone else. Deborah waited. She had learned a long time ago that silence could tell you things people were too frightened to say. "Start talking," she repeated. Leonard swallowed. The project was in trouble. Deborah stared at him. "What project?" "The redevelopment." "The one you've been working on for months?" "Yes." "The one you told me was under control?" Leonard looked down. "Yes." Deborah nodded slowly. "Okay." She folded her hands in front of her. "Tell me why my money was being directed toward it." Leonard took a breath. "It wasn't supposed to be permanent." Deborah's eyes narrowed slightly. I didn't ask whether it was permanent. I was going to put it back. Put what back? The money. How much? Leonard hesitated. Deborah waited. Leonard, he told her. The amount was large enough that Deborah felt something cold move through her chest. She had spent years helping people understand what financial security meant. She knew exactly what that amount represented. Years of work, years of careful decisions, years of saying no to things other people considered reasonable, because Deborah understood the value of keeping her financial foundation intact. She looked at him. You were going to move that much of my money? I was trying to save the project. Without asking me. I knew you'd say no. The answer came quietly. Deborah looked away. There it was. Not an accident. Not confusion. He had known. He had considered asking her. Then he had decided that her answer was something he could work around. Why? Leonard leaned forward. Because if the project failed, people would lose everything. The investors, the businesses, the employees. I thought if I could get through the next few months. Stop! He stopped. Deborah's voice remained calm. You keep talking about the project. Because that's what this was about. No. She looked directly at him. That's what you want this conversation to be about. Leonard's face tightened. Deborah. Who is Camille? The room became completely silent. Leonard did not move. Deborah watched him. She had asked the question plainly. No accusation, no raised voice, no demand, just a name. Camille. For several seconds, Leonard stared at her. And Deborah understood. The silence was the answer. She felt her heart sink before he said anything. She's involved with the project. Deborah nodded. That's not what I asked. She works with some of the businesses. That's still not what I asked. Leonard looked away. Deborah waited. Leonard, he closed his eyes. There's something between us. Deborah's fingers tightened together. What does that mean? He opened his eyes. We've been seeing each other. Deborah stared at him. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She didn't throw the papers across the room. She simply sat there. It was almost as though her mind had become too overwhelmed to choose an emotion. How long? Leonard hesitated. How long? About a year. Deborah looked down. A year. She thought about all the ordinary things that had happened during that year. Birthdays, dinners, the mornings when Leonard kissed her before leaving for work, the nights he came home late, the times he told her he was tired, the conversations they had never had. Does she know about me? Yes. Does she know we're married? Yes. Deborah nodded. Does she know we're still together? Leonard looked uncomfortable. We've talked about our marriage. That's not what I asked. Deborah, I told her things were complicated. Deborah's eyes lifted. Of course you did. He flinched. She looked back at the papers. Did you tell her our marriage was over? Leonard said nothing. Deborah didn't need him to answer. She leaned back in her chair. How long have you been deciding what I was allowed to know? Leonard looked at her. The question seemed to reach somewhere deeper than the affair. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Deborah continued. You decided I didn't need to know about the business. I was trying to protect you. You decided I didn't need to know about Camille. I didn't want to hurt you. You decided I didn't need to know you were considering using my money. I was trying to fix everything. Deborah nodded. Do you hear yourself? I love you. She looked at him. For the first time, something in her expression broke. Don't say that right now. Leonard became quiet. Deborah stood and walked toward the kitchen. She needed distance, not because she was afraid of him, because she was afraid of what she might say if she stayed seated. She put both hands on the counter. Behind her, Leonard remained at the table. Deborah, she closed her eyes. What? I never meant for any of this to happen. She turned around. That's the problem, Leonard. He looked at her. You keep talking about what you meant. Her voice was still controlled, but now there was pain beneath it. I need you to understand what you did. Leonard lowered his head. Deborah looked at the man she had married, the man whose coffee preferences she knew, the man whose business problems she had mistaken for stress. The man who had come home late and kissed her cheek while another woman waited somewhere else for his attention. She realized then that the betrayal was not one moment. It wasn't just the affair. It wasn't just the attempted transfer. It wasn't even the lies. It was the years of information Leonard had carefully controlled. Every omission had changed the reality Deborah was living inside. Every explanation had allowed her to make decisions based on incomplete information. She had trusted him, and he had used that trust as a reason not to tell her the truth. Deborah walked back to the table. She picked up the folder. "I want everything." Leonard looked up. "What do you mean?" "Everything. Deborah, your business records, the project documents, the financial structure, everything connected to the transfer. I can explain." "I don't want your explanation." Her voice was quiet. "I want the truth." Leonard stared at her. For once, Deborah saw no immediate answer in his face, only fear, and that frightened her more than anger would have, because Deborah had spent her life understanding money. She knew how to examine numbers. She knew how to find inconsistencies. She knew how to recognize when something didn't belong, but she had never imagined that one day she would have to apply those same instincts to her own marriage. She picked up her purse. "Where are you going?" "To find out what happened." "Deborah, please." She stopped at the doorway. Leonard looked at her. She wanted to hate him. Part of her thought she should, but hatred was too simple. And what Leonard had done was not simple. He had betrayed her. He had lied to her. He had tried to use her money without permission. And somehow, he had convinced himself that he was doing it to protect the life they had built together. Deborah looked at him one last time. "Whatever you thought you were protecting, Leonard." She paused. "You should have protected it by telling me the truth." Then she walked out, and for the first time in years, Deborah left her own home without knowing whether she would ever feel at home there again. Deborah did not call Leonard the next morning. She didn't call him that afternoon either. Instead, she sat in a conference room at her Madison office with a legal pad in front of her and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Across from her sat Gideon Price. Gideon was a financial investigator Deborah had worked with professionally on several complicated cases over the years. He was not a dramatic man. He did not make assumptions quickly, and he had a habit of reading documents twice before saying what he thought they meant. Deborah trusted that. She needed someone who would not tell her what she wanted to hear. "I want facts," she said. Gideon nodded. "That's usually a good place to start." "I don't want you to tell me whether Leonard is a good person." "Wasn't planning to." "I don't want you to tell me whether I should leave him." "That's not my job." "I know." Gideon opened the folder Deborah had brought. "Then what do you want to know?" "Everything." He looked at her. Deborah corrected herself. "Everything that can be established." That was the difference between Deborah and the person she had been the day before. The woman who had sat across from Leonard had been a wife, trying to understand what had happened to her marriage. The woman sitting across from Gideon was a financial professional, trying to understand what had happened to her money. She needed to keep those two women separate. Otherwise, she knew she would drown in the emotions of the first and fail at the job of the second. Gideon reviewed the attempted transaction. He looked at the destination structure. Then he looked at the documentation connected to the request. After several minutes, he leaned back. "This isn't a transfer to Camille." Deborah looked at him. "I know her name is there." "So do I." "Then what are you saying?" "I'm saying the money wasn't being directed into her personal account." Deborah stared at him. "Then why is her name attached to it?" "Because she's connected to the redevelopment structure." Deborah felt something inside her tighten. "So Leonard wasn't trying to give her my money?" "Not directly." She looked down. The distinction should have made her feel better. It didn't. Gideon continued. "The request appears to have been structured around the project." "The project he was having an affair with her through?" Gideon paused. "I don't know how to answer that." "Neither do I." He returned to the documents. "The important thing is that the attempted transaction was not a simple personal transfer." "Then what was it?" "A capital contribution." Deborah was quiet. Gideon looked at her. The money would have been used to support the redevelopment structure, and Leonard would have controlled the project. That's what the documents suggest. Deborah looked toward the window. For a moment, she felt almost relieved. Then she caught herself. She had nearly made the same mistake Leonard had made. She was trying to make the situation simpler by finding a distinction. He wasn't giving her money to Camille. He was using her money for a business. But Deborah knew better. The problem was never only where the money was going. The problem was that it was hers, and she had not agreed to it. What else? She asked. Gideon hesitated. There's more. Deborah looked at him. Tell me. The business is in worse shape than you were led to believe. She felt her stomach tighten. How much worse? Significantly. Gideon began laying out the information. Outstanding obligations, loans, refinancing, personal guarantees, properties supporting other properties. Deborah listened. The numbers were not unfamiliar to her. The pattern was, Leonard had been moving forward by solving today's problem with tomorrow's money. For months, possibly longer. Why didn't I know about this? Gideon looked at her. That's not something the documents can answer. Deborah nodded. She understood. She continued reading. Then something stopped her. What is this? Gideon leaned closer. Which part? This. She pointed to a series of documents. Gideon studied them. Those are asset protection measures. Deborah frowned. Whose assets? Yours, primarily. She looked at him. What? Gideon explained that Leonard had taken steps that, under certain circumstances, could have protected specific assets associated with Deborah from exposure if his business collapsed. Deborah stared at the documents. She felt confused. Why would he do that? Gideon shrugged slightly. Maybe he was trying to protect you. Deborah laughed once. There was no humor in it. From what? From his business. She stopped laughing. The contradiction was almost impossible to hold in her mind. Leonard had been betraying her. He had been lying to her. He had been trying to access her money without telling her. And yet, at the same time, he had taken steps that might have protected her if his company failed. Deborah looked at Gideon. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't have to. She frowned. What do you mean? People can have conflicting motives. Deborah shook her head. Not like this. Actually, yes, exactly like this. She said nothing. Gideon continued carefully. Leonard may have wanted to protect you from the consequences of his business decisions, while also trying to use your assets to prevent those consequences from happening. Deborah looked down at the papers. He was trying to save me from the fire while pouring gasoline on it. Gideon did not respond. Because there was nothing to add, Deborah turned another page. There were documents she had never seen, decisions Leonard had made without her, preparations for possibilities she had never been told existed. Then another realization struck her. Was he preparing for divorce? Gideon looked at her. I can't tell you that. But these documents could have several explanations. Such as? Asset protection, estate planning, business risk management. Or preparing to leave me. Gideon remained quiet. Deborah looked away. She thought about Camille. She thought about Leonard telling another woman that his marriage was essentially over. She thought about the way he had continued coming home to Deborah every night. The two realities collided inside her. She had spent years believing marriage meant building one life with another person. Leonard had apparently been building several. Gideon closed the folder. There's one thing I want you to understand. Deborah looked at him. Go ahead. You need to separate what you know from what you suspect. She nodded. Right now, you know he attempted to move your money without your authorization. Yes. You know his business is under significant pressure. Yes. You know he has a relationship with Camille. Deborah's expression tightened. Yes. But you don't yet know why he took steps to protect certain assets. She looked down. No. And you don't know what he intended to do if the transfer succeeded. Deborah sat quietly. That was the hardest part, because Leonard's actions did not fit neatly into one category. He was not simply a villain who had decided to steal from his wife. He was a frightened man who had made increasingly terrible choices while convincing himself that each choice was temporary. That did not make what he had done acceptable, but it made the truth harder to understand. Deborah gathered the papers. I need to see Camille. Gideon looked at her. Are you sure? No. She placed the documents back into the folder. But I need to hear what Leonard told her. Gideon nodded. Deborah stood. At the door, she stopped. Gideon. Yes? If you were me, what would you do? He considered the question. Then he answered honestly. I wouldn't make any permanent decisions while you're still trying to understand what happened. Deborah nodded. That was not the answer she wanted, but it was probably the answer she needed. She left the room carrying a folder filled with facts. What she did not yet understand was that facts could explain what Leonard had done. They could not explain why the man she loved had become someone capable of doing it. Camille chose a coffee shop on the west side of Madison. Deborah arrived 10 minutes early. She sat near the window with her hands wrapped around a cup she had barely touched and watched people come and go. A young mother struggled to get a stroller through the door. 2 college students argued quietly over something on a laptop. An older man stood at the counter, carefully counting bills before ordering his coffee. Ordinary life. Deborah found herself thinking that was the strangest part of betrayal. The world did not stop. People still went to work. Children still needed rides. Bills still arrived. Coffee still cost too much. And somewhere inside all those ordinary moments, your life could change without anyone around you knowing. At 2:07, Camille walked in. Deborah recognized her immediately, not because Leonard had ever shown her a picture, because Leonard had talked about her. Not directly, never enough to make Deborah suspicious. But there had been references. A woman involved with the redevelopment, someone who understood the local businesses, someone Leonard had described as very capable. Deborah had never asked for a name. She wished she had. Camille looked around the room. Then their eyes met. For a moment, neither woman moved. Camille walked toward the table. Deborah? Yes. I'm Camille. I know. Camille stopped. Deborah saw the surprise in her face. Leonard told me. Camille sat down slowly. There was an awkward silence. I wasn't sure you'd come, Camille said. Neither was I. Camille looked at her coffee. I don't know what to say. Neither do I. That seemed to make Camille uncomfortable. Perhaps she had expected anger. Deborah couldn't blame her. If she had been Camille, she might have expected anger too. Instead, Deborah felt something more complicated. She was angry, but underneath the anger was exhaustion. She didn't want to spend another hour fighting a version of the truth. She wanted to understand it. How long have you known Leonard? Camille answered carefully. About 1.5 years. Professionally? At first. Deborah nodded. And then? Camille looked up. Then it changed. How? We started talking. About the project? At first. Deborah almost smiled. That's what he told me too. Camille looked startled. Leonard told you about me. He told me there was someone helping with the redevelopment. He didn't tell you about us. No. Camille looked down. I didn't know he was still married. Camille closed her eyes briefly. Yes. Deborah watched her. Camille, you knew he was married. Yes. Then what didn't you know? Camille took a breath. I thought the marriage was over. Deborah said nothing. He told me you were basically living separate lives. Deborah's expression remained still. Did he tell you that? Yes. When? Early on. And you believed him? Camille looked at her. I had no reason not to. Deborah almost responded immediately. Then she stopped, because that wasn't entirely true. Camille had known Leonard was married. She had chosen to believe the version of the marriage he gave her. But Deborah understood something uncomfortable. She had done something similar. Not with the affair, not with Camille, but with everything else. Leonard had told Deborah the business was under control. She had believed him. He had told her the late nights were because of work. She had believed him. He had told her there was nothing to worry about. She had believed him. Not because she was foolish, because she loved him. Deborah looked at Camille. Did he tell you he was going to leave me? Camille hesitated. Yes. The answer was quiet. Did he give you a timeline? No. Did you ask? Sometimes. And what did he say? Camille looked away. He said he needed to get the business under control first. Deborah felt something shift inside her. She almost laughed, not because anything was funny, because Leonard had been using the same crisis to explain everything. The business problems justified the secrecy justified the distance justified the affair, and the affair somehow became another reason he needed to save the business. Everything led back to the same excuse. He was trying to fix things. Did he ever tell you that he loved me? Camille looked at her. Yes. Deborah's throat tightened. When? Several times. Deborah nodded slowly. Did he tell you he loved you? Camille's eyes filled with tears. Yes. Neither woman spoke. The answer sat between them. Two women, one man, two promises, two different versions of the same life. Finally, Camille whispered, I didn't know. Deborah looked at her. Didn't know what? That he was still this close to you. Deborah stared at her. Camille shook her head. I know how that sounds. Yes. I thought he was staying because of the business, because of finances, because it was complicated. That's what he told you? Yes. Deborah looked out the window. That's what he told me too. Camille became still. Deborah turned back. Not about you. I know. He told me everything was complicated. Camille's face changed. For the first time, Deborah saw something like realization. What did he tell you about the money? Deborah watched her carefully. Camille looked confused. What money? The investment structure. Camille's expression tightened. What about it? Did you know he was trying to use my portfolio? Camille stared at her. Your portfolio? Yes. No. Deborah studied her. You knew he was looking for money. Yes. From me? I didn't know. Did you ask? Camille hesitated. Yes. What did he say? Camille looked down. He said it wasn't what I thought. Deborah felt a bitter sadness move through her. That's exactly what he told me. Camille looked up. Their eyes met, and suddenly the two women understood the same thing at the same time. Leonard had not simply lied to one woman and told the truth to the other. He had managed information. He had given Deborah one version, Camille another, his business partners another, his investors another. Each person had received enough truth to keep believing him, not enough truth to see the whole picture. Camille covered her face briefly with one hand. Oh, God. Deborah remained silent. I thought I knew him. So did I. Camille looked at her. I am sorry. Deborah nodded. I know. I mean it. I know. Camille wiped her eyes. Are you going to leave him? Deborah looked down at her coffee. I don't know. Do you hate me? The question surprised her. Deborah thought carefully before answering. No. Camille looked at her. I should, shouldn't I? I don't know. You have every reason. Maybe. Deborah's voice was quiet. But I don't think hating you will tell me the truth. Camille swallowed. Do you think I'm responsible? Deborah looked at her. You're responsible for your choices. Camille nodded. So are you. Yes. Deborah paused. But Leonard is responsible for his. Camille looked down. That was the first time Deborah saw her understand the full weight of what had happened. Not because Camille was innocent. She wasn't. She had knowingly entered a relationship with a married man. But Leonard had been the one who had promised each woman a different future. He had been the one who controlled what each knew. He had been the one who decided that everyone could be kept apart as long as he needed them to remain there. Deborah stood. Camille looked up. That's it? For today. Deborah. She stopped. Camille's voice was barely audible. I really did love him. Deborah looked at her. I believe you. Camille's eyes filled again. Do you still love him? Deborah stood quietly. Then she answered honestly, That's the problem. She walked out. She drove home without turning on the radio. When she reached the house, she sat in the driveway for nearly 20 minutes. She thought about Camille. She thought about Leonard. Then, unexpectedly, she thought about herself. Miriam's question returned. Do you trust him, or do you trust the person you remember him being? For the first time, Deborah realized the answer had never been as simple as she wanted it to be. She had trusted Leonard, but she had also trusted the explanations that allowed her to remain comfortable. She had seen the late nights and accepted them. She had noticed the distance and called it stress. She had recognized the financial warning signs in his behavior and assumed that if he needed her, he would ask. She had not been foolish. She had been in love, and sometimes love did not make you blind. Sometimes it simply made you willing to explain away what you would have questioned in anyone else. Deborah finally walked into the house. She went upstairs. She closed the bedroom door. Then she sat on the edge of the bed. For the first time since the alert had appeared on her computer, she allowed herself to stop being strong. Her shoulders began to shake. She covered her face, and she cried, not only because Leonard had betrayed her, not only because another woman had been part of his life. She cried because she was beginning to understand that the marriage she thought she knew had never been fully visible to her. There had been rooms in Leonard's life she had never been allowed to enter. Conversations she had never heard, decisions she had never known were being made. And while Deborah had been building a life she believed they were sharing, Leonard had been living parts of another one beside it. She cried until she was exhausted. Then she wiped her face and sat in the quiet. The next morning, she would have decisions to make. But that night, Deborah finally understood something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Trust is not the same as surrendering your judgment, and loving someone does not mean you have to stop asking questions. Sometimes the hardest lesson is realizing that the person you trusted most was not the only person who made choices without telling you. You did too. You chose not to look. You chose to believe. And when the truth finally came, you had to forgive yourself for the part of you that had wanted the beautiful version of the story to be true. The next few weeks changed the way Deborah looked at numbers, not because the numbers themselves had changed, because now she knew what they could hide. Gideon continued reviewing Leonard's financial records, and each new discovery made the picture more complicated. One afternoon, Deborah sat across from him as he placed another folder on the table. "I need you to understand something," Gideon said. Deborah looked up. "What?" "This is bigger than the attempted transfer." She felt a familiar heaviness settle in her chest. "How much bigger?" Gideon opened the folder. "Leonard's business has obligations that aren't immediately visible from the public records." "Explain." "There are agreements with lenders, private investors, and partners that create overlapping responsibilities." Deborah studied the documents. "Is he insolvent?" "I can't give you a definitive answer yet." "Can you tell me if he's close?" Gideon paused. "He's closer than he wants anyone to know." Deborah looked down. She thought about the way Leonard had spoken about his business. Temporary, manageable, under control. Words that had sounded reassuring when she heard them at home now sounded almost absurd. Gideon continued. "The attempted transfer raises questions because of how the funds were represented." Deborah looked at him. "What kind of questions?" "Whether the money was being presented to other parties as available capital, whether Leonard had made commitments based on funds he didn't actually control, whether certain investors were given a complete picture of the financial position." Deborah sat very still. "Are you saying he lied to them?" "I'm saying we need to determine exactly what he represented." "What's the difference?" "The difference is evidence." Deborah nodded. That was why she had hired Gideon. He didn't turn suspicion into fact simply because the suspicion seemed obvious. But Deborah understood the implication. If Leonard had used her portfolio as part of a plan to reassure lenders or investors, then the attempted transfer might expose a much larger problem. The issue was no longer simply that Leonard had tried to access her money. The issue was what his business had been built upon. Deborah spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing documents. She saw names she recognized. People who had invested their savings, people who had trusted Leonard, employees who had spent years working for him, small business owners who had planned their futures around the redevelopment project. Terrence's name appeared in one set of documents. Deborah stopped. She remembered him standing in the bakery. "My whole business is depending on this." She closed the folder. That evening, Deborah sat alone in her office long after everyone else had gone. The city outside was dark. Her computer screen remained illuminated. She had enough information now to do something Leonard would fear. She could expose him. She could give the documents to investors. She could make sure every person connected to the business understood what Leonard had done. She could tell them about the attempted transfer. She could tell them about Camille. She could tell them about the financial decisions he had hidden. Part of her wanted to, not because she wanted to destroy him, because she wanted someone else to know what she had been forced to discover. She wanted Leonard to feel the humiliation she had felt, the helplessness, the shock, the sick realization that the person you trusted had been living beside you while withholding the truth. Deborah opened a blank email. She typed the first line, then stopped. She thought about the employees, the receptionist who had worked for Leonard for 8 years, the project manager who had spent months coordinating construction, the small business owners who had already invested time and money. Terrence. She thought about the investors too. Some of them had probably made mistakes. Some may have been careless, but not all of them had done anything wrong. Deborah stared at the screen. If she exposed everything publicly, Leonard would suffer, but so would people who had nothing to do with his choices. She closed the email. That was when Deborah began to understand the difference between accountability and revenge. Accountability asks who needs to know the truth so the damage can be stopped. Revenge asks who can be hurt so the pain feels fair. They can look similar from the outside, but they are not the same. The next morning, Deborah met with Gideon again. "I want to know what has to be disclosed," she said. Gideon looked at her. "And what doesn't?" "Yes, that's a complicated question." "I know. You could make this very public." Deborah nodded. "I could. And Leonard's business could collapse immediately. Maybe. Employees could lose their jobs. I know. Some investors could lose money. I know. Terrence could lose the opportunity he's been depending on." Deborah looked down. "That's what I don't want." Gideon studied her. "You're still protecting people connected to him." "No." Deborah lifted her eyes. "I'm protecting people who didn't choose this." There was a difference. She wasn't trying to save Leonard. She was trying not to become consumed by what he had done. "If Leonard broke the law, I won't hide it," she said. "If investors were misled, they deserve to know. If authorities need information, I'll cooperate." Gideon nodded. But I won't release every private detail just because I'm angry." He watched her carefully. "Even Camille?" Deborah thought about the woman sitting across from her in the coffee shop. "No." "Why?" "Because the affair isn't relevant to every financial question." Gideon nodded. Deborah looked toward the window. She had spent her life believing that being right meant proving someone else wrong. Now she was learning something more difficult. Sometimes being right meant refusing to use the truth as a weapon, when the truth could be used as evidence instead. Leonard had made choices. Soon, he would have to live with them. But Deborah was beginning to understand that she also had a choice. She could spend the rest of her life making sure Leonard suffered. Or she could make sure the truth reached the people who needed it, protect those who could still be protected, and then walk away. She wasn't sure which choice would hurt less, but she knew which one would allow her to live with herself afterward. Leonard came to Deborah's office on a Thursday afternoon. He hadn't called first. Her assistant appeared at the doorway with an uncertain expression. "There's someone here to see you." Deborah looked up from the documents on her desk. "Who?" Her assistant hesitated. "Leonard." For a moment, Deborah simply stared at her. Then she closed the folder. "Send him in." Leonard walked through the door a few seconds later. He looked different, not physically. He was still wearing the same expensive coat he had owned for years, and his hair was still carefully combed. But something about him seemed smaller. The confidence he had once carried into every room was gone. He closed the door behind him. "Hi." Deborah looked at him. "Hi." He stood there. She gestured toward the chair. "Sit down." Leonard sat. Neither of them spoke. Deborah had learned that silence made Leonard uncomfortable. Normally he filled it. This time he didn't. Finally he said, "I've been trying to reach you. I know. You haven't answered." "I wasn't ready to." Leonard nodded. He looked down at his hands. "I need to talk to you." You've said that before. I mean it this time. Deborah leaned back. Then talk. Leonard took a breath. The situation with the business is getting worse. Deborah almost smiled. That's your opening? What do you want me to say? The truth would be a good start. I am telling you the truth. No, Leonard. Her voice remained calm. You're telling me the part of the truth that you need me to hear. He looked away. I don't know how to fix this. Deborah studied him. That was probably the first completely honest thing he had said to her in weeks. You can't fix it with me. I wasn't asking you to give me money. Then what are you asking? Leonard hesitated. I need time. Deborah said nothing. If I can keep the project moving, I can recover. How? The financing is being renegotiated. You told me that 2 months ago. It wasn't finalized. And now? Now there are other options. Deborah looked at him. Which ones? Leonard didn't answer. Exactly. He rubbed his forehead. Deborah, I know what I did. Do you? Yes. Then tell me. Leonard looked at her. I betrayed you. That's one thing. I lied to you. Another. I tried to use your money. Without your permission. Yes. And? Leonard's face tightened. I hurt you. Deborah nodded. Yes. He leaned forward. But I was trying to protect you. Deborah stared at him. There it was again. The explanation he had used so many times that it had almost become a belief. If the project survives, Leonard continued, I can repay everything. I can fix the business. I can make sure you're protected. Deborah shook her head. You still don't understand. Understand what? You're still asking me to trust a future you can't prove exists. Leonard looked frustrated. I just need time. Deborah's expression changed. Time is not the same thing as trust. Leonard went quiet. She continued. You keep asking me to give you time because you think time will somehow make what happened less true. That's not what I'm doing. Then what are you doing? I'm trying to keep everything from falling apart. Deborah looked at him. Everything already fell apart. Leonard's eyes became wet. Deborah, no. She stood. He looked up at her. You don't get to come into my office and ask me to help you manage the consequences of decisions you made while deliberately keeping me uninformed. I wasn't trying to hurt you. If you wanted to protect me, you would have told me the truth. Leonard looked down. Deborah could see his breathing change. For the first time, she wondered if he had finally run out of explanations. I was afraid, he said. She stopped. Leonard's voice was quieter now. I was afraid of failing. Deborah remained standing. I couldn't make the project work. I couldn't make the financing work. Every time I thought I had a solution, something else went wrong. He wiped his face. And I couldn't tell you. Why? Because you would have looked at me differently. Deborah's expression softened for only a moment. Leonard, I spent my whole life trying to be the man who had everything under control. She sat back down. Leonard continued. My father was like that. He never admitted he was struggling. Never. Even when he couldn't pay a bill, he'd act like everything was fine. Deborah listened. He used to say a man had to keep his problems to himself. Leonard laughed bitterly. I believed him. You became him. Leonard looked at her. That's what I was afraid of. Deborah felt the weight of that confession, not because it excused anything. It didn't. But because, finally, she was hearing the fear beneath the behavior. Leonard wasn't afraid only of losing his business. He was afraid of becoming the man he had spent his life trying not to become. He was afraid Deborah would see weakness. Afraid she would leave. Afraid his reputation would disappear. Afraid that if he admitted he couldn't handle everything, the entire identity he had built around being capable would collapse. And somewhere along the way, he had decided that hiding the truth was easier than facing the consequences of telling it. But Deborah knew something he hadn't understood. You didn't protect me from the truth, she said. Leonard looked at her. You protected yourself from my reaction to it. He stared at her. She continued. You were afraid I would be disappointed in you. I was. You were afraid I would leave. Yes. You were afraid I would see you as weak. Yes. So you lied. Leonard's eyes filled. Yes. And then you had an affair. He looked away. Yes. And then you tried to use my money. His voice broke. Yes. Deborah nodded slowly. Do you understand now? Leonard looked at her. I thought I was protecting everything. No. She shook her head. You were protecting yourself. Leonard covered his face with both hands. For several seconds, Deborah said nothing. She had imagined this moment differently. She had imagined screaming. She had imagined throwing him out. She had imagined making him feel the same pain he had caused her. But now, watching him sit there broken by the consequences of his own choices, she felt something unexpected. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Something closer to sadness, because she finally understood that Leonard had not become dishonest overnight. He had made one decision after another. Each one probably seemed manageable. Each one probably seemed temporary. Until eventually, he was sitting in his wife's office asking for time to repair a life he had damaged by refusing to tell her the truth. Deborah looked at him. I am not giving you my money. I know. I am not hiding anything for you. I know. If your investors need to know something, they need to know it. Leonard closed his eyes. And if the business fails, then it fails. He looked at her. Just like that? Deborah's voice was quiet. No. She shook her head. Not just like that. She looked at the man she had loved for years. It will hurt. Leonard said nothing. It will hurt you. It will hurt people who worked for you. It may hurt people who trusted you. She paused. But you don't get to prevent consequences by creating new victims. Leonard looked down. Deborah gathered the documents on her desk. Your business is your responsibility now. And us? She stopped. The question hung between them. Deborah looked at him for a long time. I don't know. Leonard nodded. It was not the answer he wanted, but perhaps it was the first honest answer either of them had received in a long time. He stood. At the door, he turned back. Deborah. She looked up. I'm sorry. She believed him. That was the hardest part. She believed he was sorry. She simply no longer believed that being sorry was enough. Leonard left. Deborah remained at her desk. She looked at the closed door, then at the documents in front of her. For years she had believed that love meant standing beside someone when life became difficult. Now she was learning that there was a difference between standing beside someone and carrying them. She could care about what happened to Leonard. She could hope he found a way forward. She could even remember the good years without pretending the bad ones never happened. But she could not rescue him. Not anymore. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do for another person is stop protecting them from the consequences they need to face. And sometimes the most important boundary you can set is the one that says, I love you, but I will not destroy myself to save you from yourself. Deborah did not make her decision in one dramatic moment. There was no single morning when she woke up and suddenly knew exactly what to do. Instead, the decision came through a series of smaller choices. A meeting, a document, a signature, a conversation she didn't want to have, then another. The first thing Deborah did was separate her financial life from Leonard's completely. Not emotionally. That would take much longer. Financially, that she could do. She met with her attorney. She met with Gideon. She reviewed every account that had any connection to Leonard's business. She changed access. She documented what had happened. She made sure that the attempted transfer was formally recorded and that no one could later claim she had authorized it. She did not hide the truth, but she also did not exaggerate it. When professionals asked what happened, Deborah told them exactly what she knew. Nothing more, nothing less. That became her rule. If she knew it, she said it. If she suspected it, she said she suspected it. If she didn't know, she said she didn't know. It was a simple discipline, but after everything Leonard had done, Deborah found something almost healing about it. For the first time in months, she wasn't managing someone else's version of reality. She was dealing with facts, and the facts were difficult. Leonard's business could not continue as it had. The financial structure had to be reorganized. Certain obligations had to be renegotiated. Some investors demanded answers. Others walked away. The redevelopment project was placed under new oversight. Leonard was no longer in a position to make every decision himself. When Deborah heard the news, she felt no satisfaction. She had once imagined that seeing Leonard lose control would make her feel vindicated. It didn't. It made her sad, because behind every business headline were real people. Employees who worried about their paychecks, small business owners who had planned their futures around the redevelopment, investors who had trusted someone they believed understood what he was doing. Terrence was one of them. Deborah saw him several weeks later outside a neighborhood restaurant. He recognized her. For a moment, neither said anything. Then Terrence approached. "I heard the project is changing." "It is." He nodded. "Does that mean it's dead?" "No." His shoulders lowered slightly. "That's good." Deborah looked at him. "Terrence, I don't know what will happen." He studied her face. "You knew?" The question was quiet. Deborah knew what he meant. "Not at first." He looked away. "Leonard told us everything was fine." Deborah didn't answer. "I believed him," Terrence said. "So did I." Terrence looked at her. Something about that answer seemed to surprise him. Then he nodded. "I hope it works out." "So do I." They stood there for another moment. Terrence wasn't asking Deborah to forgive Leonard. He wasn't asking her to protect him. He was simply hoping that something he had built his future around would survive. Deborah understood that. She walked away knowing that sometimes the consequences of one person's decisions spread farther than anyone intended. That did not mean the person should be protected from consequences. It meant the consequences had to be handled carefully. Deborah never publicly released the private details of Leonard's affair. She did not send Camille's name to investors. She did not tell the local community every humiliating detail of her marriage. Not because Leonard deserved protection, because those details were not necessary for accountability. The people who needed to know about the financial problems were given the information relevant to those problems. The professionals who needed documentation received it. The appropriate authorities were not misled. Deborah answered questions honestly, and then she stopped. She refused to turn her pain into a public performance. That was harder than she expected. There were days when she wanted to tell everyone. Days when she wanted Leonard to walk into a room and feel every pair of eyes turned toward him. Days when she thought about the woman she had been before the alert appeared on her computer. She wanted that woman back, but Deborah slowly realized she couldn't go back. Not because her life was ruined, because she knew too much now. She knew that trust without attention could become complacency. She knew that love could coexist with deception. She knew that someone could care about you and still make choices that deeply harmed you. And she knew something else. Consequences were not always punishment. Sometimes consequences were simply reality arriving. Leonard had to live with the reality of his decisions. The business had to live with the reality of its finances. Investors had to live with the risks they had taken. Camille had to live with the fact that she had entered a relationship with a married man who had not told her the whole truth. And Deborah had to live with the fact that she had stayed inside a marriage where she had stopped asking questions. None of those truths canceled the others. They could all exist at once. Eventually, Camille left. The relationship with Leonard did not survive the collapse of the story he had created around it. Without promises of a future, without the excitement of secrecy, without Leonard telling her that everything would eventually work out, there was very little left. Deborah heard about it from Gideon. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. The marriage was different. Deborah and Leonard began the process of divorce. It was not dramatic. There were no screaming matches in court, no public accusations, no attempt to destroy each other, but there were difficult conversations. There were documents. There were long evenings when Deborah sat at her dining table reviewing papers that represented the ending of a life she had once believed would continue forever. Sometimes Leonard called. Sometimes they spoke about practical matters. Sometimes they remembered something from their marriage, and both became quiet. The strange thing was that Deborah did not stop loving him immediately. She wished she had. It would have been easier. But love did not disappear simply because trust had. She could still remember the young man she had married. She could remember the good years, The vacations, the jokes, the ordinary Sunday mornings. She could remember Leonard making her laugh when she had been too tired to smile. Those memories were real, so was the betrayal. Deborah eventually learned that healing did not require her to choose which truth was more convenient. She could hold both. Leonard had loved her. Leonard had betrayed her. Both were true. He had tried to protect her. He had also protected himself at her expense. Both were true. She had loved him. She had trusted him. She had failed to ask questions she should have asked. And none of that made his choices her fault. Both were true. Months later, Deborah stood in her office, looking out at Madison. Her life was quieter. Not easier, but quieter. Her finances were secure. Her work was growing. She had started spending more time with friends she had neglected during the years when Leonard's business seemed to consume every conversation. She was learning how to be alone without feeling abandoned. That was perhaps the hardest lesson. One evening, she found herself thinking about the woman who had sat across from her in the coffee shop. Camille. For a long time, Deborah had wanted to place her in a simple category. The other woman, the enemy, the person who had entered her marriage and helped destroy it. But the truth was more complicated. Camille had made her own choices. Leonard had made his. Deborah had made hers. And none of them could undo what had happened by pretending the story had only one villain. That realization did not make Deborah forgive everyone. It made her more honest. One afternoon, Gideon stopped by her office. "How are you doing?" Deborah smiled faintly. "That's a dangerous question." "Why?" "Because people usually want a simple answer." Gideon smiled. "And you don't have one?" "No." She looked out the window. "Some days, I'm fine. And other days I miss the man I thought I married." Gideon nodded. Deborah continued, "But I don't miss the life I was living." There was a long silence. Then she said something that surprised even herself. "I think that's the difference." Gideon looked at her. Deborah finally understood what the entire experience had cost her. Not just a marriage, not just money, certainty. She had believed that if you loved someone long enough, you eventually knew them completely. Now she understood that people remained complicated, even after decades together. You could know someone's favorite meal and not know their deepest fear. You could know how they took their coffee and not know what they were hiding. You could share a home with someone and still fail to notice the distance growing between you. That did not mean love was meaningless. It meant love needed honesty. It needed attention. It needed the courage to ask difficult questions before the answers became impossible to ignore. Deborah never rescued Leonard, but she did not destroy him either. She let the truth do what truth was supposed to do. It forced everyone to deal with reality. Leonard had to face the consequences of his choices. Deborah had to rebuild a life she had never expected to live alone. Camille had to accept that the future she had been promised was never what she believed. Terrence and the other business owners had to adjust to a project that was no longer controlled by the man who had originally promised it to them. Nothing went back to the way it had been. Perhaps that was the point, because sometimes life does not give you back the version of yourself you were before the betrayal. Sometimes it gives you something different, something more honest. Months after the divorce was finalized, Deborah received one final letter from Leonard. She almost threw it away. Instead, she opened it. It wasn't long. He apologized. Not for everything. He couldn't possibly apologize for everything, but for enough. He told her he had finally understood that his greatest mistake had not been failing financially. It had been believing that failure was something he had to hide. He wrote that he had spent so much time trying to appear strong that he had forgotten strength also meant telling the truth when the truth made you look weak. Deborah read the letter twice. Then she folded it. She did not call him. She did not write back. She simply placed it in a drawer, not because she wanted to hold on to him, because she wanted to remember the lesson. That night, Deborah sat alone at her kitchen table, the same table where she had once placed the papers in front of Leonard, the same table where she had asked, "What is this?" She looked around the room. The house felt different now, but it was hers, not because Leonard was gone, because Deborah had finally learned that home was not something another person could give you or take away. It was something you had to build inside yourself. She thought about revenge, how tempting it had been, how easy it would have been to release every detail, to make Leonard's private failures public, to punish him until the pain inside her felt justified. But she was glad she hadn't, not for Leonard, for herself, because Deborah had learned that accountability and revenge may begin with the same truth, but they lead to very different places. Accountability says, "This happened, you must answer for it." Revenge says, "This happened, now I want you to hurt as much as I do." Deborah had chosen the first. It had not made the journey painless. It had simply allowed her to leave the marriage without becoming someone she did not recognize. She turned off the kitchen light. Before going upstairs, she paused beside the table. For years, she had believed that the worst thing Leonard had done was betray her. She no longer believed that. The worst thing would have been allowing his betrayal to determine the kind of person she became afterward, and Deborah refused to let that happen. She had lost a marriage. She had lost certainty. She had lost the future she thought she understood. But she had not lost herself. And in the end, that was the one thing she refused to let anyone take from her. The divorce was quieter than Deborah had imagined. For months, she had expected the ending of her marriage to feel like something enormous. She thought there would be a final argument, a moment when one of them would say something so cruel that neither could ever take it back. She imagined leaving the courthouse with tears running down her face, while Leonard stood somewhere behind her. Instead, most of it happened in conference rooms, at desks, over phone calls, inside emails that began with polite greetings and ended with requests for signatures. The end of a marriage, Deborah discovered, involved an extraordinary amount of paperwork. There were questions about property, questions about accounts, questions about things that had once seemed too ordinary to matter. Who would keep the house? Who would take responsibility for certain obligations? What happened to the furniture they had chosen together? What happened to the photographs? The practical questions were sometimes harder than the emotional ones. One afternoon, Deborah sat across from Leonard at a conference table while their attorneys reviewed a document. Leonard looked tired, older than she remembered. Deborah realized she probably looked different too. Not older, just changed. Their attorneys discussed a property issue. Deborah listened. Then Leonard leaned slightly toward her. "Do you remember the first house we lived in?" Deborah looked at him. "The one with the terrible plumbing?" He smiled. "That one. The bathroom ceiling leaked every time it rained. You said it had character." "I lied." Leonard laughed. It was a small laugh, familiar. For one brief second, Deborah saw the man she had known before everything became complicated. She remembered moving into that house with mismatched furniture. She remembered eating takeout on the floor because they hadn't unpacked the kitchen yet. She remembered Leonard trying to assemble a bookshelf and refusing to read the instructions. She remembered how young they had been, how hopeful, how certain that love would be enough. Then the attorney turned a page, and the moment passed. Deborah looked down at the document in front of her. She had spent months wondering whether all those memories had been false. She no longer believed that. That was one of the hardest things to accept. The marriage had contained real love. The laughter had been real. The affection had been real. The years they had shared had happened. Leonard's betrayal did not erase them. It simply changed what they meant. Deborah had once thought that if a marriage ended because of betrayal, she would need to rewrite the entire past. She would have to convince herself that every good memory had been a lie. But that wasn't true. People were capable of loving you and hurting you. They were capable of being kind in one moment and selfish in another. They could be good at some things and deeply destructive at others. Leonard's failures did not mean Deborah had imagined every good thing. They meant the good things had not been enough to overcome the damage. After the meeting, Deborah and Leonard walked toward the parking lot together. Neither spoke for a while. Finally, Leonard said, "I never thought we'd be doing this." Deborah looked ahead. "Neither did I. Do you ever think about what would have happened if I had told you sooner?" She stopped walking. Leonard stopped too. "Yes. What do you think?" Deborah considered the question. "I think everything would have been different." "Would you have helped me?" "Maybe." Leonard looked at her. "Would you have stayed?" Deborah's expression softened. "I don't know." He nodded. That was probably the most honest answer she could give. They continued walking. At the cars, Leonard stopped again. "Do you hate me?" Deborah looked at him. No. His face changed slightly. I don't think I ever could. But, she took a breath, but I can't be married to you. Leonard nodded. That was the sentence that finally made the ending real. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. There was no shouting, no accusation, just a woman telling the man she had loved for years that love alone could no longer sustain the life they had built. Leonard looked down. I understand. Deborah wasn't sure he did. Perhaps understanding would take him years. Maybe it would take her years too. The divorce was finalized months later. When Deborah signed the final documents, her hand did not shake. She had expected it to. Instead, she felt tired. She looked at the signature. Her name, Deborah. The same name she had written on countless documents throughout her life. But somehow, that signature felt different. She realized that for years, she had thought of herself as part of a unit. Deborah and Leonard, their home, their finances, their future, their plans. Now the word "their" was disappearing from places where it had lived for years. It was painful, but there was also something strangely freeing about it. Deborah did not have to pretend the marriage had been perfect. She did not have to pretend it had been entirely terrible. She didn't have to hate Leonard to leave him. She didn't have to erase the good years to justify the ending. A relationship could contain genuine love and still end because trust had been destroyed. Both things could be true. That evening, Deborah returned to the house one last time. The rooms were quieter than she remembered. Boxes stood near the walls. Some furniture was gone. She walked into the kitchen. The table was still there. The same table where she had placed the papers. The same table where she had asked Leonard what they meant. She rested her hand on the back of a chair. For a moment, she remembered the life that had existed there. Then she let the memory go. Not because it meant nothing, because it had meant something. And perhaps that was why it was okay to leave it behind. Deborah walked through the house slowly. She did not say goodbye aloud. She didn't need to. When she stepped outside, she locked the door. Then she stood on the porch. For years, she had believed that losing Leonard would mean losing a part of herself. She finally understood that she had been wrong. She had not lost herself. She had simply spent too long believing that her identity was something she had built with another person. Now she had the opportunity to discover what remained when the word "we" no longer defined every part of her life. Deborah got into her car. Before starting the engine, she looked once more at the house. There was sadness. Of course there was. But there was no hatred. And there was no desire to go back. She started the car. Then she drove away. The marriage was over. The memories were not. And Deborah finally understood that healing did not require pretending she had never loved Leonard. It required accepting that she had, and accepting that sometimes loving someone deeply does not mean you are meant to remain with them forever. Sometimes it simply means you were part of each other's lives for as long as you could be. And when trust is gone, leaving can be an act of honesty too. Deborah's new home was smaller. The first morning she woke up there, she stood in the kitchen and didn't know where anything was. That surprised her. She had spent years knowing exactly where Leonard kept the coffee, exactly which cabinet held the plates, exactly how long it took the shower upstairs to get hot. In the new house, she opened 3 wrong drawers before finding the silverware. She stood there holding a spoon and laughed. It was the first genuine laugh she had had in days. Then she looked around. The kitchen was quiet. No second toothbrush in the bathroom. No men's shoes near the front door. No voice from another room asking whether she had seen the car keys. The silence was strange, but it was hers. Deborah set the spoon down. Then she made coffee. She drank it standing by the window. For the first time in years, she wasn't waiting for anyone else to wake up. She could decide what the day would look like. At first, that freedom felt almost frightening. She had spent so much of her adult life making decisions with another person in mind that making them alone felt unnatural. Where should she travel? What should she do with her weekends? Should she stay late at work? Should she cook dinner? Should she go out? There was no one to consult, no one to accommodate, no one to disappoint. She was free. And freedom, Deborah discovered, could feel a lot like uncertainty before it started feeling like peace. The financial work took longer. She reorganized her investments, She reviewed accounts she had once assumed would remain untouched for decades. She updated beneficiaries. She examined documents more carefully. She made sure her financial structure reflected her own decisions and not the assumptions of a marriage that no longer existed. Nothing about the process was glamorous. There were spreadsheets, phone calls, meetings, forms, long evenings spent reading documents when she would rather have been watching television. But Deborah no longer saw financial independence as an abstract concept. She had lived through the moment when it became the difference between having choices and having none. That realization changed the way she worked with clients. One afternoon, a woman sat across from her in Deborah's office. She was in her early 60s, recently divorced. She had spent most of her marriage letting her husband handle the investments. Now she was trying to understand what she actually owned. "I feel embarrassed," the woman said. Deborah looked at her. "Why?" "Because I don't know any of this." "You're learning now." "I should have known years ago." Deborah leaned back. "Maybe." The woman looked surprised. Deborah smiled gently. "But being ashamed won't teach you." The woman looked down at the papers. "I trusted my husband." "I understand." "Was that wrong?" Deborah thought carefully. "No." The woman looked up. Deborah continued. "Trusting someone isn't wrong." "Then what should I have done?" "Learned anyway." The woman frowned slightly. Deborah pointed toward the documents. "You don't need to understand every investment strategy in the world. You don't need to manage every account yourself. You don't need to become a financial professional." She paused. "But you should know what you own." The woman nodded. "You should know where your money is." Another nod. "You should understand what happens if something changes." The woman looked at her. "Even if I trust my husband?" "Especially then." The woman became quiet. Deborah softened her tone. "Not because you expect him to betray you." She tapped the papers lightly. "Because life changes." That became something Deborah said often. She never turned her experience into a campaign against marriage. She never told women that husbands could not be trusted. She never encouraged people to live suspiciously. Instead, she spoke about awareness. She told women to read the documents they signed, to understand their accounts, to know the difference between jointly owned and individually owned assets, to maintain some level of financial independence, to ask questions when something didn't make sense. And when someone said, "But my husband handles all of that," Deborah never responded with fear. She simply said, "That's fine, but you should still understand it." There was a difference. Trust did not require ignorance. That became Deborah's message. One evening, Miriam sat across from her at a small restaurant downtown. They had known each other long enough that Miriam no longer asked permission before challenging her. "You look better," Miriam said. Deborah raised an eyebrow. "That's your way of saying I looked terrible before?" "Yes." Deborah laughed. "I appreciate your honesty." "You needed it." "I did." Miriam took a sip of water. "How are you really?" Deborah thought about it. "I'm rebuilding." "That's not an answer." "It's the best one I have." Miriam smiled. They sat quietly for a moment. Then Deborah said, "I used to think preparation could prevent pain." Miriam looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I thought if I understood enough, planned enough, saved enough, and prepared enough, I could prevent bad things from happening." Miriam nodded slowly. "And now?" Deborah looked through the restaurant window. "Now I think preparation doesn't prevent every disaster." "No, it just gives you more options when one happens." Miriam smiled. "That's wiser." Deborah laughed softly. "Or more expensive. Sometimes those are the same thing." They both laughed, but the thought stayed with Deborah. She had spent years believing that her knowledge could protect her from everything. It couldn't. She had understood money. She had understood risk. She had understood markets. She had understood contracts. But she had not understood what Leonard was doing inside his own mind. No amount of preparation could have guaranteed that. The realization was humbling, but it was also freeing, because Deborah no longer blamed herself for failing to predict another person's choices. She could acknowledge what she had missed. She could learn from it, but she did not have to spend the rest of her life punishing herself for not knowing what she had never been told. Months passed. Her routines changed. She joined a walking group. She began having Sunday dinners with friends. She traveled occasionally. She spent more time with people she had neglected during the years when Leonard's business consumed so much of their attention. She learned to enjoy small things again. A quiet morning, a book, a meal she didn't have to coordinate with anyone, a Saturday when she could change her plans without explaining herself. Her life was not perfect. There were still difficult days. Sometimes she dreamed about Leonard. Sometimes she woke up angry. Sometimes she remembered something from their marriage and felt the old ache return. Healing, she discovered, was not a straight line, but gradually the pain stopped being the center of every day. One evening, Deborah returned home after a long day at work. She put her keys on the counter. Then she noticed something. She was tired, but she was not afraid. Not afraid of what she would discover. Not afraid of what someone else had decided without telling her. Not afraid that her future depended entirely on another person's honesty. She stood in the quiet kitchen, and she realized that was what she had been rebuilding all along. Not just her finances, not just her home, herself. She had not become stronger because Leonard betrayed her. She had become stronger because, after the betrayal, she chose to learn what the experience had to teach her. And one of those lessons was simple. Financial independence was not about expecting the worst from the people you loved. It was about making sure that if life ever changed unexpectedly, you still had the freedom to choose what came next. Deborah turned off the kitchen light. Then she went upstairs. For the first time in a long time, she felt something that had nothing to do with Leonard. Peace. It wasn't complete. It wasn't permanent, but it was real. And Deborah was learning that sometimes rebuilding your life doesn't mean creating something that looks exactly like what you lost. Sometimes it means creating something that finally belongs entirely to you. Several years passed before Deborah heard Leonard's name again in any meaningful way. By then, the sharpness had gone out of it. His name no longer made her stomach tighten. She didn't feel the need to know where he was or who he was with. She had stopped wondering whether he was happy. That surprised her. There had been a time when Leonard occupied an enormous amount of space in her mind. Now, most days, she didn't think about him at all. That was how she knew she had healed. Not because she had forgotten, because she had stopped organizing her life around what he had done. The redevelopment project survived, not in the form Leonard had originally imagined. The leadership changed. The financing was restructured. Some businesses left, others stayed. Terrence's business eventually became part of the completed development, though the process took longer and cost more than anyone had expected. Deborah heard about it from a former colleague. She was glad, not because Leonard had succeeded, because people who had depended on the project had finally gotten a chance to move forward. Camille disappeared from Deborah's life entirely. There was no dramatic final confrontation, no friendship, no reconciliation, just distance. Over time, Deborah learned that Camille had moved on. She had built a different life. Deborah didn't resent her. She didn't think about her often. The woman who had once represented the most painful part of Deborah's story had eventually become just another person whose life had continued after a difficult chapter. That was something Deborah understood better than most. Life did continue, even after the things you were certain would destroy you. One Saturday afternoon, Deborah was attending a small professional gathering when someone mentioned Leonard. She was standing near a table with coffee and pastries when a former business associate approached her. "I heard Leonard is doing okay." Deborah looked at him. "Is he?" The man smiled. "Smaller operation now." Deborah nodded. "That sounds like him. He seems happier." She smiled faintly. "I hope so." The man hesitated. Then he said, "He talks differently now." "About what?" "About what happened." Deborah didn't ask. She didn't need to. The man continued. "He apparently tells people that his biggest mistake wasn't the affair." Deborah looked at him. "Really?" "He says it was the night you asked him if he was in trouble." Something inside Deborah became still. She remembered. She had almost forgotten the exact moment. It had been months before the transfer, before Camille's name, before the papers on the kitchen table, before everything came apart. She had been sitting across from Leonard at dinner. He had looked exhausted. She had noticed the way he kept checking his phone. She had noticed how distracted he seemed. And she had asked him a simple question. "Are you in trouble?" Deborah remembered the way he had looked at her. Just for a second, there had been something in his face. Fear. Then it disappeared. "No," he had said. Just one word. No. At the time, Deborah had believed him. Now, years later, she understood something she hadn't been capable of understanding then. That was the moment. Not the affair, not the attempted transfer, not even Camille. The moment was the question, "Are you in trouble?" And Leonard had been given an opportunity to tell the truth. He could have said yes. He could have admitted that the business was struggling. He could have told her he was frightened. He could have told her that he had made mistakes. He could have told her that there was another woman. He could have told her everything. The marriage might still have ended. Perhaps it wouldn't have. Deborah would never know. But he could have given her the dignity of making decisions with the truth in her hands. Instead, he had chosen control. He had decided what Deborah was allowed to know. He had decided what information she could handle. He had decided that his fear mattered more than her right to understand the life they shared. That was the deeper betrayal. Not simply that he lied, that he believed he had the right to manage her reality for her. Deborah sat quietly for a moment. The man across from her was watching her carefully. "Are you okay?" She smiled. "Yes." And this time, the answer was true. Years earlier, she had thought the marriage ended when she discovered Camille. Now she understood differently. The marriage had ended much earlier. It had ended in pieces. Every time Leonard chose concealment over honesty. Every time he answered a difficult question with a carefully constructed half-truth. Every time he told himself he was protecting Deborah when he was really protecting himself. The discovery had simply revealed what had already happened. Deborah didn't need to hate him for that. She didn't need to forgive everything either. She could simply understand it. And understanding, she had learned, was not the same thing as excusing. That evening, Deborah went home. She changed into comfortable clothes and made herself tea. Then she sat near the window. The sky outside was beginning to darken. She thought about the woman she had been years earlier. The woman sitting in her office, staring at an account alert. The woman who had believed her biggest problem was money. She smiled sadly. The money had never been the real loss. The portfolio survived. Her investments survived. Her financial independence survived. Even the life she had once thought was over eventually became the beginning of something else. What Leonard had threatened to take from her was much harder to measure. Certainty, trust, the belief that the person beside her saw her as an equal. The belief that if something important happened, they would face it together. Those things were harder to rebuild, but she had rebuilt them. Not with Leonard, with herself. That was the part Deborah had never expected. For years, she had trusted herself professionally. She trusted her judgment with clients. She trusted her ability to read financial statements. She trusted herself to recognize risk, but she had not trusted herself emotionally. She had questioned her instincts. She had dismissed her concerns. She had accepted explanations because accepting them was easier than confronting the possibility that something was wrong. After the divorce, she slowly learned to listen to herself again, not to become suspicious, not to assume everyone was lying, but to pay attention. If something didn't make sense, she asked. If she didn't understand something, she learned. If someone gave her an answer that didn't feel complete, she didn't automatically accuse them. She simply asked another question. That was the difference. Deborah had once believed that trusting herself meant always being right. Now she knew better. Trusting yourself did not mean you would never miss a warning. It meant that when you discovered you had missed one, you would not abandon yourself because of it. You would learn. You would adjust. You would keep going. The next morning, Deborah stood in front of the mirror while getting ready for work. She looked at herself. Older, wiser, different. She thought about the philosophy she had shared with clients for years. Money did not guarantee happiness, but understanding your money gave you choices. She had believed that lesson was only about finances. Now she understood it was about life. Understanding gave you choices. Knowing the truth gave you choices. Knowing yourself gave you choices. And sometimes, when someone you loved made a decision that changed everything, The most important choice was deciding what kind of person you would become afterward. Deborah had chosen not to become bitter. She had chosen not to become reckless. She had chosen not to punish innocent people for Leonard's mistakes. She had chosen not to rescue him from consequences. She had chosen to forgive some things without reopening the door to everything. And most importantly, she had chosen to trust herself again. Not blindly, not perfectly, but honestly, that was enough. A few weeks later, Deborah was speaking to a group of women about financial independence. At the end of the presentation, one woman raised her hand. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How do you know when you should trust someone?" The room became quiet. Deborah looked at the woman. It was a question she had once spent years trying to answer. Now she knew there was no perfect answer. "You don't," she said. A few women shifted in their chairs. Deborah continued. "You can love someone. You can know them for 20 years. You can believe they would never hurt you." She paused. "And sometimes they still make a choice you never expected." The woman listened. "So, what do you do?" Deborah smiled gently. "You don't spend your life trying to predict every possible betrayal." She looked around the room. "You learn to trust yourself enough to respond when the truth arrives." The room remained quiet. Deborah continued. "Trust doesn't mean surrendering your judgment." She let the words settle. "It means choosing to believe someone while still remembering that you are responsible for your own life." She looked down at the notes in front of her. "You can love your husband and understand your finances. You can trust your partner and still read the documents. You can forgive someone and still decide they no longer have access to your life. And you can hold someone accountable without destroying everyone connected to their mistakes." The woman who had asked the question nodded slowly. Deborah smiled. Then she said the thing she wished she had understood years earlier. Preparation doesn't prevent every disaster. She looked around the room. But it can give you the strength and freedom to choose what happens next. That evening, Deborah drove home through Madison. The city looked different in the fading light. People were walking their dogs. Parents were picking up children. Cars were moving through intersections. Somewhere, people were falling in love. Somewhere else, someone was discovering that the person they trusted had lied to them. Life was happening everywhere, ordinary, complicated, uncertain. Deborah stopped at a red light. For a moment, she thought about the portfolio. The money Leonard had tried to reach. The money that had once seemed like the center of the entire crisis. She understood now that it had never been the real victory. The portfolio survived, but that was not what mattered most. The real victory was that Deborah had survived the collapse of the life she thought she knew, without allowing the collapse to become the definition of who she was. She had learned that love and trust were not the same as surrendering her judgment. She had learned that forgiveness did not require access. She had learned that accountability did not require cruelty. And she had learned that sometimes the most painful betrayal was not the lie itself. It was discovering that someone you loved had decided, without asking you, what truth you were strong enough to handle. Leonard had made that decision for her, but he no longer could. No one could. Because Deborah had learned something more valuable than how to protect a portfolio. She had learned how to protect herself without closing her heart. The light turned green. Deborah drove on. She didn't know exactly what the next 10 years would bring. For the first time, she was comfortable with that. She couldn't control what another person might do. She couldn't guarantee that love would always make someone honest. She couldn't prevent people from making fearful, selfish, or destructive choices. But she could control what she did when the truth arrived. She could ask questions. She could listen. She could leave. She could forgive. She could begin again. And if life ever asked her to rebuild once more, Deborah knew something she hadn't known before. She would be ready, not because she expected disaster, because she trusted herself to face whatever came. And perhaps that was the greatest thing she had kept after all. Not the money, not the house, not the marriage, herself. She had lost a life she thought would last forever. But somewhere along the way, she had found the one person she would never again abandon. Her own self. If Deborah's story reminded you of something you've experienced, or perhaps someone you know, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever learned that trusting someone doesn't mean giving up your own judgment? And do you believe it's possible to forgive someone while still choosing to walk away? Thank you for spending these moments with us here at Daily Comfort Stories. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need this reminder today. Until we meet again, remember this: you can love people deeply, but never abandon yourself in the process. Sometimes, the greatest second chance isn't getting back what you lost. It's discovering who you are after you've lost it. Take care of yourselves, my wonderful family. We'll see you in the next story.